I've broken this tabernacle study into 3 sections. The first one is a general overview. Second section goes into the details of the sanctuary services. And finally, the third one covers the prophetic importance of the sanctuary services and the terminology used in the tabernacle. Today we're going to cover the sanctuary services. In Psalm 77, verse 13, we read, "Your way, O God, is in the sanctuary." So as we study the sanctuary service and the various services that are performed there, we will be learning about God's ways, God's character, and God's ways of dealing with mankind. It says in the Bible that the earthly tabernacle or temple is a copy or a shadow. God's real temple is in heaven. The size and beauty and majesty of God's real heavenly sanctuary is beyond our comprehension. No man-made building could adequately represent it. But God has given us the earthly sanctuary to help us grasp its key elements and functions. And that's what we'll be studying today, the earthly sanctuary. So we're going to start with the tabernacle of God. I want you to think of this study sort of as a tour of the sanctuary that has a number of stops. And we're going to get in our sanctuary tour bus, and we're going to visit a lot of stops along the way. And you'll see all these various elements here of the sanctuary. We'll be studying each one of those as we go along in this study. So our next stop will be to find out what is God's pattern for the sanctuary. Where did we get the pattern for the sanctuary? In Exodus 25 we read, God gave instructions to Moses. He said, "Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you." So God gave the pattern to Moses, and he was told to make it exactly like it was shown to him. Moses met with God on the mountain, and God gave him the specifications for the tabernacle, and when he came down off the mountain, he made arrangements for building of the sanctuary. Now, if you've ever had an opportunity to go to France and visit the Eiffel Tower, you'll see what this example here really means. If I were to show you a sketch or a copy of the Eiffel Tower, and you could see the size of the trees here, for example, you might get some idea on the size and the majesty or the grandeur of the Eiffel Tower. But if you actually went and visited the Eiffel Tower, you'd have quite a different recollection of it from actually visiting it and going up on the various landings versus the sketch. Though the sketch would give you some sort of an idea what the real thing would look like. Well, this is what God has done with us, for us, with his sanctuary. There are 2 sanctuaries. The first, the real one, is in heaven. And God gave us a copy for us to build on earth. And this copy that God gave us is a copy of the real one that's in heaven. And in the Bible, it's also called a shadow. So he gave us a copy or a shadow of the real thing so we can relate to what the heavenly sanctuary is all about. We find in the book of Exodus in chapters 25 and 26, this is where God documents, or where we find in the Bible where God documents to Moses what he wants made. And here it says, "And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them." So every aspect of the services, the furniture, the altars, the courtroom, and even the priest's garments were carefully specified by God. And you can take the time to read this. It's in Exodus 25 and 26. So our next stop on our tour will be the tabernacle. This is the tabernacle in the desert, as it's called. This picture here that I'm showing you is kind of cool. It shows the tabernacle situated in the middle amongst all the tribes in the desert here. And actually, the way these tribes are laid out, God specified them. In the Exodus there, you'll see that it says exactly where the tribes should be laid out versus the east, north, west, and south. And of course, these are the names of the tribes. The Levites were the priesthood, and they had the center section of this layout. And of course, the center of this section is where the tabernacle actually was located, in the very center. You can see here that this is the entranceway. So the entranceway was from the east. So these are the key parts of the tabernacle that we're going to study today. We'll talk a little bit about the entranceway, the courtyard, the bronze altar. It's also called the altar of burnt offering in the Bible and other places. The laver, the tent of meeting. That's this building here that has a tent kind of a covering on the top. And that has two rooms in it. One of them is called the Holy Room, and the other one is called the Most Holy Room. And in the Holy Room, there's the altar of incense, table of showbread, and the golden candlestick. And in the Most Holy Room is the Ark of the Testimony. So we're going to go through each one of these and cover some of the details of them. So our next stop on our tour is the courtyard. The courtyard was an enclosed space about 150 feet by 75 feet, enclosed with white linen curtains. So you can see these little curtains all the way around here. They were very bright and white. It was about 50 cubits or 75 feet long there and 100 cubits there. And this white reminds us that Christ is our righteousness. So the curtains were hung on silver hooks and on silver connecting rods, and they were connected to 60 posts of bronze with silver tops, and each post stood in a socket of bronze. So this was made so that it was easily to take apart. So when they moved in the desert for 40 years, they would move the tabernacle with them, and it was easy to set up again. Our next stop will be the entrance to the tabernacle. The entrance was formed from a woven white, blue, and purple and red material hung on 4 pillars, and it was the entry gate into the tabernacle. And so this showed people that as soon as they went through this entry gate, they were on holy ground. This was sacred ground for them. This also reminds us that Christ is the only way to God. It is through Christ that we can find salvation in God. So the sinner must come to the entry gate here and present their offering at that gate. And once they walked onto inside the sanctuary, they were on holy ground. Well, let's take a look at the bronze altar now, or the brazen altar, or the altar of burnt offering, as it's called. The bronze altar was placed near the entrance gate. So here's the entrance gate over here, and as soon as you got in here, you'd see the bronze altar with its fire going 24/7, and you'll see the priests officiating around it. As I've mentioned, it's also called the altar of burnt offering. And this reminds us that Christ is our sacrificial offering. It is through his sacrifice that we are saved. So the fire on the altar was kept burning by the priests. It was never let to go out. And they had the responsibility of keeping this burning, which was no small task if you consider the many hundreds of animals that were sacrificed on this in a period of time. Now, there were 5 different offerings in the temple services. There were both compulsory and voluntary offerings. And at first sight, these do seem a little bit confusing, so I'm going to try to simplify it here and give you an overview of them. So the first 3 offerings were mandatory. That means that you had to do them. They were atonement for specific unintentional sin or confessed sin. And they're called the sin offering, the guilt or trespass offering, and finally the burnt offering. Now these can be found in Leviticus, and you can pause this video if you want and copy these texts down, but they're found in Leviticus. You can read more about them. Now the last 3 offerings were what are called voluntary acts of worship. Out of their love for God and God's blessing towards them, there were 2 offerings here. There was the grain offering and the peace offering. So there was a total of 5 different offerings. 3 were mandatory and 2 were voluntary. So how does a sinner make atonement for his sins? What is the process? Well, number 1, he stood before the altar of burnt offering with his sacrifice, and he places his hand on the sacrificial animal and confesses his sin. It's a very personal thing. Then he cuts the jugular vein of the animal's neck, and the priest captures some of the blood in a cup. And the priest then dips a small tree branch into the blood and sprinkles some of the blood on the horns of the bronze altar. So God designed this process to teach everyone that guilt is transferred from the sinner to the sacrificial animal only by the shedding of the sinless blood of the animal at the temple altar. So the sin is transferred from the sinner to the animal by the sinless blood. And we can read this also in Hebrews 9:22. It says, "Remember, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin." So this ties very well with the Old Testament sacrificial system. Now we're going to quickly go through the various offerings here. So the burnt offering was complete destruction of the animal except for the hide, in an attempt to renew the relationship between the holy God and the sinful man. So the burnt offering was burnt up wholly on the altar, and it was left to smolder all night in the ashes, and then the ashes were removed in the morning. So that's why it's called the burnt offering. It is completely burnt up. Yeah, because of the burning upon the altar all night into the morning. That's why it's called the burnt offering. And these are the animals that were sacrificed, depending upon the individual's financial wealth, and they would choose one of these animals. Now, sin offering was different in several particulars. It was called for when a soul sinned through ignorance against any of the commandments of the Lord concerning things that ought not to be done. That's in Leviticus 4:2. For example, if anyone of the common people sins unintentionally, well, the common people are anyone other than the high priests or the leaders of the people. These are just the regular folks, if you will, common people. So if any of the common people sin unintentionally by doing something against any of the commandments of God, of the Lord, he shall bring as his offering a kid of the goats, a female without blemish for his sin which he has committed. And he shall lay his hand on the head of the offering and kill the sin offering at the place of the burnt offering. Now, sin offering for the high priest, which is illustrated here, or the congregation in general. Sometimes the congregation, the entire nation, would sin against God. So this is how they would get atonement. When the sins of ignorance become known, whether in the case of a priest or the whole congregation, a young bullock was to be brought as a sin offering. So the bullock was not to be consumed on the altar like the burnt offering, yet it was to be consumed, though in a different way. When it had been killed by the offender, and a portion of its blood had been taken by the priest into the tabernacle and sprinkled by the priest's finger 7 times before the veil, and that's the veil, the inner veil, if you will, in the tabernacle, and put by touch on the 4 horns of the altar of incense. So it's a little different process here. Then the rest of the blood was to be poured out at the bottom of the bronze altar. That's where they always poured the remainder of the blood. And the fat of the animal was to be burnt on the altar, and then the body was to be carried out of the camp to a place of ashes, and there burnt on a fire of wood. So it was not to be burnt on the altar of burnt offering. Okay, let's look at the guilt or trespass offering. Now, this was a mandatory atonement for an intentional or unintentional violation that requires restitution, the confession of sin and the forgiveness of sin or cleansing from defilement. So God's portion of this offering was the fatty portions, and it was burned on the altar of burnt offerings. Then the priest's portion was to be eaten in the holy place by the priest, and the offender's portion was none because he sinned. And then the remainder was to be burned outside the camp. Now the grain offering was a little different. It was comprised of grain, fine flour, olive oil, incense, baked bread, or salt, and it was to accompany the burnt offering. And it was a voluntary act of worship and devotion in recognition of God's goodness and his providences. And finally, the peace offering was a voluntary act in which the worshiper accepted meat from God as a token of his covenant faithfulness and gave God acknowledgement and praise for his past blessings that were given to them. So any animal from the herd or flock could be used. The uniqueness of the peace offering was that in the communal meal that was the worshiper and the family ate before God. So this was a communal meal that they ate before God near the sanctuary. So the offerings that were specified in the book of Leviticus for the children of Israel, as it's called, these were the common people. And these are the various offerings: the sin offering, guilt offering, burnt offering, grain offering, and peace offering. And these are the various animals or grains, etc., that would be part of that offering. Now, there's one thing I've got to explain to you here. Now, if you look at the little layout here of the 12 tribes, all 12 tribes didn't go to the tabernacle each month to offer their sacrifices. Each tribe was given a month to come to the tabernacle to get forgiveness for their sins. So you might ask, what about the other 11 tribes? What are they supposed to do? They have to wait 11 more months before they can get forgiveness for their sins? Well, God made provisions for this. For the other 11 months of the year, the daily, as it's called in the Bible, this was for the corporate atonement for the rest of the tribe. And this occurred every morning and evening. So an animal was sacrificed in the morning and the evening for the other 11 tribes, if you will, until it was their turn to come to the sanctuary and offer their own sacrifices for their own sins. So this was corporate atonement. I'll cover this a little bit more here in a second. Now, I've mentioned the high priest, his offerings were different. And this is actually the high priests and the leaders of the Israel nation. So their offering, because they were more serious, they had a more expensive offering that they had to offer for their sins. Now, I've mentioned about this daily burnt offering. There was one lamb in the morning and one in the evening. We read about this in Exodus 29, and we read here, "Now this is what you shall offer on the altar, 2 lambs of the first year, day by day, continually." These are daily. "One lamb you shall offer in the morning, and the other at twilight," or in the evening. "And it shall be a continual burnt offering throughout your generations at the door of the tabernacle." So God wanted 2 offerings. So the high priest evening and morning daily services at the altar of burnt offering benefited the whole community. And that's why it's called a corporate atonement. It's until you had your chance to come to the sanctuary and with your own animals for the other 11 months, these covered your sins. Of course, these are the two lambs that were offered. So the sacrificial atonement system was the center of the sanctuary service here. We had the individual atonements, we had the priestly atonements, and we had the corporate atonements that went on at this sanctuary service. Individual, priestly, and corporate. Okay, now our next stop will be the laver. The laver is located right here, right next to the altar of burnt offering, and between that and the tent of meeting. So the laver or basin, it's a piece of furniture that the priest would use to cleanse himself. This was very serious business. Before the priest could approach God, he had to be cleaned by water, or he would die. He couldn't go into the tent of meeting unless he was clean, and he had to clean himself at this laver. And we have nothing but filthy rags, and it's Christ that cleans us up. He's our cleanser. Okay, our next stop will be the tent of meeting. Okay, the tent of meeting had 2 rooms in it. The first room is called the holy room, and the second one is called the most holy room. And it had a very elaborate outer covering. And from the outside, when looking at it, all you could see were the hides of the badger skins, and they weren't very pretty looking. But the priests from the inside, they could see the beautiful curtains and the finely twisted linen and embroidery on the roof material here. Very beautiful. Many a sermon has been given about these various coverings here. I'm not going to go into that today. That's not the purpose of this video. But there's many things to be learned about this roof ceiling material. So the entrance to the tent of meeting hung on 5 pillars, and the priests were only allowed to enter into this door. Only priests were allowed to enter into this door. No common person could go in there, only the priests. And of course, Christ is our high priest officiating in the sanctuary in heaven now. So there were 2 rooms in this tent of meeting, the holy place and the holiest of places, or the most holy place. So this is my little plastic demo of the temple. Now, this was the inner veil. So it had a beautiful embroidered material that separated the 2 rooms, the holy place from the holiest of holies. All right, our next stop will be the tent of meeting, and we're going to look at the furniture in there. So the furniture in the holy place consists of the golden candlestick here, the table of showbread right here, and the altar of incense right here. Of course, this is the most holy. We'll cover that here in a second. The golden candlestick was the only light in the room. There were no windows, there were no other lanterns or anything, and the priest's duty was to keep this full of oil and burning all the time. So we know that Christ is the light of the world. The golden candlestick was quite a deal, I think. It was all made of pure gold. Had 7 lamps, and it used a talent of pure gold. Now, you can figure out what this is worth in today's money, but it weighed nearly 200 pounds, was 5 feet tall, and 3.5 wide. And so it was estimated to be worth millions of dollars. I don't know really what it would be worth today, but it would be really something. So the table of showbread was on the north side, and that reminds us that Christ is the bread of life for us. So it was made of Arcadia wood, had pure gold and gold overlay molding on its rim, had golden rings. You can see this little example here, the rings that the posts or the poles stuck through. That was used for carrying it in different places. And the bread and the plates were put on there, and the bread was there at all times before God. They were changed out every week. And the priests were allowed to eat the bread from the past week. Next, we're going to take a look at the altar of incense. Now, that was just before the veil, the inner veil, between the holy and the most holy area. The altar of incense occupied a space near the veil leading into the Holy of Holies. It was a gold-covered box, about 3 foot high, 18 inches wide. It had 4 horns on it, 1, 2, 3, 4. Of course, blood was dripped on those horns. And it was used every day during the daily service, the morning and evening services. Now, incense in the Bible is a symbol of prayer. In Psalms 141, it says, "May my prayer be set before you like incense. May the lifting up of my hands be like the evening sacrifice. So prayers are like incense. And the Apostle John said, and when the Lamb had taken it, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before him. So when he took the book of life, they all fell down before him. Then each one had a harp, and they were holding golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saint. So we read this in Revelation 5:8. So the incense is referring to the prayers of the saints, or our prayers. And of course, Christ is our advocate with our Father. He takes our prayers and he talks to his Father about our needs. So this altar was reserved for corporate atonement and the high priest's sacrificial services. So the high priest's evening and morning services at this altar benefited the whole community. The one exception of this is when the high priest sinned, so his atonement was presented at the altar of incense, because it was a more serious offense, because he had he was a higher authority in the Israel nation. So the high priest would dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. And the priest would put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of sweet incense before the Lord, which is in the tabernacle of meeting, and he shall pour the remainder of the blood of the bull at the base of the altar of burnt offering. So this was used in that service. So our next stop will be the censer. Censer is a thing we don't run across too often. It's a vessel in which fire was carried from place to place. Don't forget, back in those days, they didn't have matches or lighters to light a fire. So this is a very common thing, to have coals, hot coals, burning coals in a metal bucket. This is a pretty fancy one. I'm not sure what the censer in the sanctuary looked like. So the censer of burning coals was used during the Day of Atonement services, which I'll be covering in more detail in the next video. He, the high priest, is to take a censer of burning coals from the altar of incense before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense, and take them behind the curtain into the most holy place. That's in Leviticus 16. So this incense that they burned was very interesting. The Lord said to Moses, take fragrant spices, and he mentions them all here, and he says, grind some of it into powder and place it in front of the testimony in the tent of meeting, where I will meet with you, and it shall be most holy to you. And he says, do not make any incense with this formula for yourselves. Consider it holy to the Lord. So this incense, this fragrant spices that the Lord gave us the formula for here, was only to be used in the sanctuary service and not in everyday use. So our next stop will be the Ark of the Testimony, also called the Ark of the Covenant. Of course, it's situated right here. It's the second room. This is the most holy place. It's the only piece of furniture in that room. Okay, the ark's lid is called the mercy seat. Now, this is the mercy seat right here. And on each end of the lid is a cherubim, or an angel. This is two angels, and they're facing one another, looking down upon the mercy seat. And in between the cherubim is the Shekinah glory. This is the presence of God. God has actually shown himself in this room. So it's the visible manifestation of God's presence. So there's no window in this room. There's no lampstand in the most holy place. The only light that's in here is from the Shekinah glory and it's above the mercy seat between the two angels. And we can visualize Christ on the throne of grace in heaven, the glory that he has. The ark was made of Arcadia wood, 45 inches long, 27 inches deep, 27 inches high, overlaid with pure gold, and inside the ark were 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments, a golden pot of manna, and Aaron's rod that had budded. This is what was stored inside the ark of the testimony. In Deuteronomy we read, "And it came to pass, when Moses had made an end of writing of the words of this law in the book, until they were finished, then Moses commanded the Levites, which bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying," so what are we talking about here? We're talking about the book of Moses, the book of the law. So he says, "Take this book of the law and put it on the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there as a witness against you." So inside the ark of the testimony were the 10 Commandments, the manna and the rod that budded, and outside was the book of law that Moses wrote. So what is the difference between the 10 Commandments written by God's finger and the book of the law written by Moses' hand? Have you ever thought of that? What's the difference in these two laws? Let's take a look at this. So the contents of the law is found in the Bible in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So what is the law? Well, the 10 Commandments written by the hand of God, that was called the law. Then there were the book of Moses that consisted of the moral laws, various social laws, various food laws, what foods are clean and unclean, the purity laws, the various feast laws, the laws regarding sacrifices and offerings, the instructions on the priesthood, including tithing, and finally, instructions regarding the tabernacle and the altars. So these are kind of a thumbnail overview of all the various laws. So the 10 Commandments, we read in Exodus 31, it says, "When the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he," that's God, "gave Moses the 2 tablets of the covenant law," that's the 10 Commandments, "the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God." So the 10 Commandments were written by the finger of God. And God spoke these laws to Moses. And then Moses took what God gave him, and Moses wrote them down in a book and gave them to the people. So they were different. It says, "And when it came to pass, when Moses had made an end of writing in the words of his law in a book, until they were finished, that Moses commanded the Levites, which bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, Take this book of the law and put it in the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against you." So this was put outside the ark. So Jesus was crucified in AD 30 on the 70th week. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he gave up the ghost. In Colossians we read, "And you being dead to your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh, has he quickened together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was a witness against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. So my question is this: when Jesus died in AD 30, what was nailed to the cross? We read in Exodus 31 that he gave Moses 2 tablets of the testimony written by the finger of God, the 10 Commandments. In Deuteronomy we read, "Take this book of the law and place it beside the Ark of the Covenant." God gave to Moses the words that he wrote in the book of the law, and the book was written by Moses. These are 2 different things. So where in the tabernacle were the 10 Commandments in the book of Moses stored? I've already told you that. The 10 Commandments were placed inside the ark, and the book written by Moses was placed outside the ark. So and this is what was nailed to the cross, the book of Moses, not the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are God's eternal law. Moses' handwritten book was specific to Israel and was nailed to the cross. Well, we've covered a lot of material today. We've kind of taken our tour around the sanctuary. I hope you've gotten a blessing from this. In our next video, we're going to be studying the most important service of the Jewish year. It's called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So don't miss that. That's going to be a very interesting, and that's going to culminate our study of the sanctuary. So if you have any questions or comments on these studies, please send them to me at comments@thecomingcrisis.org. And if you've received a blessing from this study, why not tell your friends? You know, there are several ways you can view these videos besides the current one that you're looking at. You can get a application in the Apple Store for an iPhone or an iPad. This is a really cool application. It's called Bible Prophecy Revealed. It's $2. Or if you have an Android machine, you can go to Amazon application store, and that one is $2 also. And you'll get all these videos delivered to your phone or tablet automatically. And if you don't have those, you can watch them on YouTube or on your favorite podcast software. So there's many ways you can view these videos. So I want to thank you today for taking time to view these videos. I know you have a busy life, but thanks for taking time out to look at these. Give me some feedback. And remember that God loves you very much. God bless.